Welcome to Massey College. I'm Nathalie Des Rosiers and I am the principal of Massey College. The beautiful Massey College is built on Indigenous land, the land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. We want to acknowledge their stewardship of the land and also the opportunity that we have here to discuss good books. And today we're going to be discussing a book. The Massey community loves books, and it loves to read, and it loves to discuss books. So I am very happy to have had the opportunity to develop a little bit this new series about book launches. And today I think the book, which is The Roots and the Trees by Nizar Sultan, is a book about what I would describe as the quintessential Canadian experience, immigration. Unless you are a descendant of the indigenous community, all of us are descendants of immigration backgrounds. Maybe 8 generations or 2 generations are just in the process of doing it. But the experience of immigration, the experience of leaving a country and then arriving here and trying to adapt and to be part of the Canadian society is one that belongs to many of us at different degrees. But this book is also a very special book because it is about one particular community, the Ismaili community. And we will be discussing a little bit the role and the structure and how it has helped the Ismaili community to belong and to feel a sense of contribution to Canadian society. So I'm so excited about my panel today. Let me just talk a little bit about who we have. First, we're going to have the author, Nizar Sultan, who was born and raised in British-ruled Tanganyika, now Tanzania. And after completing high school and a 2-year teaching program, he studied in England for 5 years and graduated with a degree in economics. And his little person, his hero, is also interested in economics in the book. So he returned to Tanzania in 1967, where he worked for 5 years in tourism, infrastructure, and project development. And he and his wife migrated to Canada in 1972. In Canada, he's worked for 45 years in paid and voluntary capacities for the institutions of His Highness Prince Karim Aga Khan for the socio-economic development of the Ismaili Muslim community in Canada, for which His Highness is the spiritual leader. So he was for 15 years a manager of business consulting and financing for Ismailis in Eastern Canada, and 20 years as CEO of the Aga Khan Council for Canada. So this book is about, it's a novel, but it's inspired from real events, and we'll have a chance to really get into it. I also want to invite Niyosha Keyzad, who is, Niyosha is an alumni of Massey College. She completed an honors with the distinctions from USD in 2010, a double major in evolutionary anthropology and English. And she also received the Master of Arts in American and Post-Colonial Literatures from McGill. She's taught creative writing. She worked as the editorial assistant for the McGill News, and she spent a year teaching English in France. And she also was at Massey and has been really quite influential in pursuing a PhD at the Center of Diaspora and Transnational Studies. Her research and her interest focuses on memoirs of the Iranian diasporas, literatures of exile, displacement. And she also has really been quite influential in creating a new movement, which is about this founder of the Scarborough Studies Collective, which we have the benefit of hearing about in previous discussion. She's been a strong supporter of the book club at Massey. Really, we're so happy to have you with us today. And finally, we'll hear first actually from Dr. Azim Nanji, who serves as special advisor to the provost at the Aga Khan University and is a member of the University Board's Academic and Student Affairs Committee. He really is a specialist, a world-renowned specialist. He served as the Senior Associate Director of the Abazi Program in Islamic Studies at Stanford University and lectured on Islam in the Department of Religions throughout the world. He's written several books and really has been written. His books include the Nizar Ismaili tradition, the Muslim Almanac, the Historical Atlas of Islam, and the Dictionary of Islam. We're so honored to have you with us, Dr. Nanji, and I'd like you to maybe begin by situating the Ismaili community in the world and in Canada. I think that's your expertise, and I think that's a good introduction to the book.
So the book captures one community living in an East African context, primarily of South Asian origin, which had migrated to East Africa. But the Ismailis are part of the global diversity of Muslim communities all over the world. They live in Central Asia, in Iran, in Afghanistan, Pakistan, India, East Africa, Europe. So they represent really the global nature of Muslim communities at large. But they are a minority community. They are part of the Shia Muslim branch of Islam. And what is distinctive, I think, about their historical experience is that they've always held on to the centrality of an institution called the Imamat. And the Imamat is the spiritual office of the person who leads the community, both as a descendant of the Prophet and his son-in-law and daughter Ali and Fatima. So they continue that tradition of being custodians of Muslim knowledge, Muslim heritage, but also constantly to be engaging the community in the times in which they live, and to be able to offer them the possibility of building on a long tradition of intellectual commitment, of cultural development, but also of contributing wherever it is that they live. And I think what, in my reading of the book, Nizar has tried to capture is both the breadth, historical breadth that inspires that community, but also the individual experience that he has tried to recreate to show how those values and traditions translate into everyday life.
Well, it's a wonderful book. It's actually quite easy to read and pleasant. And I want to bring the author and ask him, so what inspired you to do that now, to write this book? What were you trying to achieve?
Well, there were two key motivating factors for me to write this book. One was my desire to document 21 years of East African Ismailis history, starting from 1957, when His Highness the Aga Khan became the spiritual leader of the community, and going to 1978, when he visited his community in Canada for the first time and asked the community to make Canada its permanent home. During this 21-year period, I had been involved very intimately with the Ismaili community, starting in East Africa when the political turmoil began there. At that time, I served as a member of the Aga Khan Council as a member for economic development, and I was involved in facilitating the immigration of Ismailis from East Africa to Canada. My wife and I arrived here in June of 1972, And in October, Idi Amin expelled all South Asians from Uganda, of which Ismailis constituted approximately $12,000, 12,000 people. And Canada accepted some 6,000 of them. So here I became involved with our institutions in the reception and establishment support of the community. And then I went on to be hired on a full-time basis to manage a loan guarantee program and a business consulting program, where under we helped establish some 750 families, Ismaili families in retail, service, manufacturing kind of businesses. And then for 20 years, I served as the CEO of the Aga Khan Council, where I was responsible for or participated with the leadership in the design and implementation of the programs for socio-economic development of the community. So I had wanted to document all this, and that was my first motivation for writing the book. Now, I'm not a historian, so I didn't want to write history. So I turned my narrative into a fictional narrative.
But it really feels like it's a fictional narrative that is populated by real life stories. You know, we can almost see you sometimes in the early chapters, I would think. No?
Yes, the characters in my book are composites of real life characters. Their stories are the real life experiences of the life in Africa and their move to Canada and their settlement here. Now, I did have to do a significant amount of research for this book, but much of the research was related to the Ismaili history.
Yeah.
Because a lot of what I have written in the book is what I was at the center of experience, center of whatever was happening, and I was experiencing it myself.
Yeah.
And I have very vivid recollections of all of the things that happened in that time frame.
Yeah. Well, it's wonderful. Let me bring in Niyosha. She can put this book in context of the large diaspora literature that we have in Canada. Is that what, when you read the book, did you read that as in that context?
For sure, and I think it was. Thank you, first of all, for sharing this work with us. I actually had some questions. I had so many questions for you. So you read, and maybe in the questions, sort of some of my comments will also come out. So you read about the Ismaili experience, obviously, from South. It's a very specific journey, very specific experience of displacement and dispossession from South Asia to East Africa. Your work is very historical. You get the sense from the very beginning. I would say it's a work of historical fiction. You've said you did a great deal of research, which I would like to hear more about. But what can we learn from the unique Ismaili experience of political turmoil as we look to so many instances of Muslim exodus around the world? What is unique? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, let's hear it
and what is
both,
shared
from both Nizar and Dr. Nanji. Maybe Nizar first, and then Dr. Nanji.
You see, from the Ismaili experience establishing in Canada, there are things that that I have thought about for a long time. As I said, when Idi Amin decided to expel the Ugandan Asians, Canada was very generous and decided to take 8,000 Ugandans, of whom 6,000 were Ismaili Muslims. 75% were Ismaili Muslims. The intake of that number of immigrants from a non-European country was the first admission by Canada of such a large group of people, not of European origin. And over time, I have asked, what if, because Canada taking that number of Ugandan refugees was really an experiment. And I've often asked myself, what if that experiment had been a failure? What if 2 years after arriving in Canada, the Ugandans had remained unemployed, were dependent on government support? What if they had failed to integrate into the wider Canadian community? What would have been the impact? What would the impact of that experiment, of that failure, have been on Canada's immigration policy for bringing people in from non-European countries? These are things that I thought about for a long time. And when I go back into history and look at what the critical success factors were for the community to get established very quickly, I see that within a short period of 5 years, Ismailis had established in Canada as an economically independent group, a socially integrated group, and had come to be respected from coast to coast for their organization, their discipline, their self-reliance, their voluntarism, their professionalism, their enterprise. And what made that happen? Well, the most critical thing in that was the guidance and support that the community received from His Highness in settling in Canada. His Highness the Aga Khan, the spiritual leader of the community. And what were the critical elements for their successful establishment here? Number one was the organization. Organization is the prelude to effective settlement, in my view. The people was organized under the prescribed by His Highness the Aga Khan, the council board structures. Number two was the discipline within the community to take direction from the leadership communicated by His Highness, the spiritual leader, to the community members. And number three was the voluntarism, the spirit of voluntarism, people coming together to network and help one another to implement programs that supported the Ismaili community.
So it's a network experience. I'd like to hear from Dr. Nanji here about, in the book, you know, you have access to borrowing money. That's the part of the support a little bit, is that the network creates you access to expertise within the community, but also to financial resources. Is that determinate? Is that really important in the settlement story?
Let me just compliment, I think, in one sense, what Nizar has laid out. I think in his work of historical reimagination, but also to point out, I mean, more broadly, I think this is an experience that seems, I think, historically, and as an historian of religion, I can say this with a certain amount of certitude, that the Jewish community or the Christian community and Muslim communities in general have always been travelers, right?
Yeah.
Either compelled to travel because of persecution and circumstances where they lived, or voluntarily because they sought to try and live in a place where they could reimagine, rebuild their lives in a free way that that didn't lead where they actually had chosen to be in a new home to be persecuted. So I think that's part of a general Muslim experience. And so, for example, I came in 1967 to McGill to study.
Yeah.
Right. So my search was a different one. I came in order to find an academic experience that was not available in Kenya, where I was born. But it seems to me, as we look at the Canadian community today, that in addition to the South Asian community, there is an Afghan community, there is a Tajik community, there is a Pakistani community, an Indian community, a Syrian community. So I think the complexity of the community has thrown up problems of how resources are shared across the board.
Yeah.
So it's not just for those. So the South Asians came prepared with an experience that was institutionally organized in a much more systematic way than Afghan Ismaili, whose experiences of being organized are very recent. So in some sense, the South Asian Ismaili community in the larger global search for identity played a catalytic role enabling these other communities also to forge an identity. I think that's one part of it. The other is that all communities, regardless of the preparation they come with or the assets that they bring to a different country, always feel a certain degree of disruption, disjunction, because the cultural environment in Canada is different and complex, and it's a predominantly, at least in those early days, an experience shaped by European experience. Right? So the matter of creating a way, a bridge to enable the community to feel a sense of coherence, but also to be seen to be a contributor to Canada, not just somebody who comes in to be a dependent, but to be able to bring a certain amount of creative energy to a new
to the project
and to be able to contribute it. So I think to Niyosha's point about the diasporic literature, it's also about this piece of literature becoming part of a Canadian literature. And that's the journey that I'm glad that Nizar wrote his book, because there are younger, minds in the community and elsewhere who should be inspired not to think of themselves as contributing only something that comes out of their past, but seen to be contributing something that's part of an evolving Canadian experience. So that 20, 30 years from now, when our grandchildren and others read these books, they will say, this is now what it means to be a Canadian.
Yeah.
Right?
Oh, that's a lovely way of presenting it. Niyosha, that's your area, the diaspora's literature. Do you see themes there that you see elsewhere in other communities expressing themselves? I mean, and I want to hear you a little bit on that, and then I want to bring another thematic here.
Absolutely. There are definitely, obviously, so many overlaps, and maybe building on what we just said, and the previous question about sort of what makes, but of course, when we talk about different diasporic communities, it's always interesting to compare what is and is not the same. So you've talked about sort of, I think, the unique spirit or culture of discipline, the spiritual governance and guidance of the Ismaili community. What I immediately think about, because of my own work on the Iranian diaspora, the post-revolution diaspora, is other examples of religion and governance or church and state are complicated. Discussions of the history of the Iranian Revolution, for example, often point in sort of common and sort of academic and political circles. They all sort of point us to the lack of focus, leadership, and spiritual guidance through any kind of a central administrative office. But you're speaking about a central administrative spiritual office, which is very unique again, the imamate. Can you talk about that on that and perhaps a very unique setting of settlement of a very considerable diasporic population here in Canada? It's a very uniquely transplanted community, a diaspora community. So I'd love to hear more about
They
that.
arrived in large numbers, which to me, there was something interesting about this. You know, you have the occasional individual story coming to McGill to study, but by and large, otherwise than that, is the story of the success because there were a large enough community that could build within itself its own resources, its own sharing, its own feeling of belonging, and being in it together. Is there a lesson there?
You see, when the Ismailis arrived here in early 1970s, there was only one social governance body, which was the Aga Khan Council for Canada, domiciled in BC, in Vancouver. And when I came here, there were 235 Ismailis. At the end of the year, there were 10,000 of us. And the new councils for social governance of the community didn't get established until the March of 1973. So there were no regional structures for social governance. Essentially, people came together. They came together and they said, if you've been here for 3 months and I've been here for 3 days, I look to you to support me, to help me, guide me where I can go, find a job, write my resume, which area I should look for accommodation in. And these volunteer support groups emerged, which assisted the community in coming together and in starting to settle in Canada. One very central element for the community was the ability to congregate in a place of worship, to offer prayers. So what we did was to go to the school authorities and request that we use their gyms to allow the community to come and pray, offer their Friday prayers. So that became the focal point for the community to attend this what we call Jamaat Khanas, and meet other Ismailis, learn from those who had found jobs, help those who were looking for jobs, guide those who had come here under the business category on where to look for businesses, what pitfalls to avoid. So it was a support system and a set of structures that that started to develop. What they drew upon was where our organizations, where we had come from in East Africa. They drew upon those examples and they replicated them in Canada. And over time, as the communities started to kind of settle in some centers, because when the Ugandan refugees were brought in here, they were dispersed all over the country. People were sent to Thunder Bay and others to North Bay, and people eventually came together in larger communities, and the support groups, the informal support groups, help them get established.
So does that mean
that this was happening? All the time this was happening, there was always the guidance from the spiritual leader, the Aga Khan.
So one big issue in Canada is to allow for smaller communities outside of the big centers to attract and retain immigrant populations. So is your experience that indeed it's difficult because you need almost a critical mass of a group for it to actually work well, for the networking and the sense of community and the help and this sort of informal little support group to emerge? Is that part of the story as well?
So in the initial period, people gravitated from the smaller centers where they had been sent to where the larger community was. But over time, people looked for opportunities outside the big cities, better quality of life, and they have moved away. So we have now communities in Kitchener and in London, Ontario, and in North Bay and Cornwall, all over the place. So people now go where their work takes them, where they see opportunities. And although we have very large concentrations of people in cities like Toronto and Vancouver and Calgary and Edmonton, the community is well dispersed.
So let's bring in Dr. Nanji. I know that we're going to have some questions from the audience. Dr. Nanji, I just want to, what do you see as the future? Are you worried that there will be some further Muslim displacement around the world and that this will happen again? And is that a worry? And do you see some trends around the world about that?
I think it's inevitable. I think given what's going on, the number of refugees that are coming out of different parts of the Muslim world. So there's a kind of globalization of the entire sort of refugee issue, which we have probably only seen rarely, maybe during the Second World War or in quite cataclysmic events. So I don't see that as ending. I think the larger question, I think, and Niyosha touched upon it, and I think Nizar has pointed that out, is how much of that notion of being a refugee creates a sense of exile and a sense of alienation, right? So maybe you don't choose people who are getting off these rafts in the Mediterranean, landing in Italy. Maybe they don't want to live in Italy, but they will have to live somewhere in Europe or somewhere else in the world unless they return to conditions that they have rejected in the past. So it's about creating a home, if use that word, where there is a certain rootedness. And I think the Ismaili community has been successful because they have negotiated that. They've negotiated for themselves as individuals and as a community a multi-layered way of approaching this. So that if there is a sense of alienation, I think it is buffered by both the collective and the individual experience. And that may be something I think that needs to be captured in a more academic, nuanced social science language to be able to see where those resources come from. And I think they come, and just to go back to one point that Niyosha made, for example, about the Iranian community being displaced after the 79 revolution, is whether they see faith purely through a theological premise, right? So faith becomes something that's imprisoned by a certain theological dogmatism. Now, I think what you've had in the historical experience of the Ismaili community is a very strong commitment to ongoing intellectual reflection and writing. And that has made the tradition more open. It has made them able to take language that's grounded in Muslim beliefs, but using that language to create new ways of expression through literature, through poetry, through philosophical writings that allow them what I would call the intellectual space that gives them the freedom to make choices about creating these layers. And that may be something I hope younger scholars will explore in greater depth, because that's the sense that I have as I look at the broader experience that we are going through globally now.
So the very act of writing, the very act of participating and expressing ideas is part of the experience and makes it in itself a way of reaching out or being part of Canada.
Nizar, in that sense, has continued this long Ismaili tradition of writing.
Yeah, that's it.
Is a great tribute to him.
And capturing the moment, being present to the world, reflecting on the world. So do you see that in your Niyosha, in your work, and also you're teaching creative writing? Do you see the way in which it's in itself helping and trying to negotiate these complex feelings about integration, rejections, exile, not being present, wanting to go back?
Absolutely. And I think it's maybe more through my own personal experience of, having moved to Toronto in the 90s. So I think my question actually in terms of the writing was why did you opt to, and you may choose not to answer this, but why did you decide to tell the story through the boys? And maybe sort of with that question, what is your target audience? A younger audience or a more broad audience?
Well, the focus of the book is on the Ismaili community, so it would be of interest to members of the Ismaili community, the East African Ismailis, but the wider Ismaili community also. But the book has entertainment value. People who have read the book have told me that they've enjoyed it very much. So
it reads well.
It reads well. It's an easy read. It's the kind of book people say they would like to sit down in front of their fireplace with a cup of hot chocolate and read it. So it has its entertainment value. Who is it directed at? Well, I hope that that people of my generation who came to Canada from East Africa, for them, the book will be of some nostalgic value. It will bring back memories and lead to conversations about the life in Africa, our departure from there, and coming here. But I would really like the younger people, both Ismaili Muslims and non-Ismaili Muslims, to read this book, to learn about one community's move from one country, coming into another country and establishing themselves successfully here and becoming part of the wider Canadian milieu. In the book, I have had a lot of emphasis that I've tried not to bring out in a preaching manner, but through the words and actions of the central characters in the book, which are centered on the ethics and values that we are enjoined to live by, which are the same ethics and values that are of Canadian ethics and values. So to live by those ethics and values in a country like Canada is very easy for us to do. And what the book seeks to do is to portray how people can live by those ethics and values and succeed in life, and not only succeed in life for themselves, but be able to contribute to the well-being of other people, not only people of their own community, but of the wider community.
So we have, I think, if the audience, we have a large audience for this book launch, it's wonderful. So if you want to put a question on YouTube, we will pick it up and put it to our panelists here. So Karim Lada, is your portrayal of women and gender roles in your book accurate for that time in East Africa? Yeah, that's a good question.
That's a good question. I would say women of my character, Yasmin, in that time, in the mid-1950s, was not characteristic of Ismaili women. But I would say that they were not a rarity either. The women could be very assertive, could be equal partners in marriage, managing, working in their husband's business, sometimes taking the lead role, not a rarity. But, you know, assertiveness, for somebody to be assertive, you have to have confidence which comes from your upbringing, the kind of education you have, and your genetic makeup. And education is a very key element in that. Our 48th Imam, Aga Khan III, had started to place strong emphasis on education in 1940s and early 50s. Following up on his guidance, larger numbers of girls started to pursue education, secondary level education. And we had more and more girls coming into our schools. And to our embarrassment, they were performing much better than we boys were performing. But if we look at the community today, the Ismaili community today, you will find Ismaili women in the highest levels of community's institutional leadership. You will find them in the highest echelons of corporate and public sectors. And now I think they're very assertive. I think they are more assertive than some men would like, but in that time, they were not. An average Ismaili woman was not that assertive.
So other questions or other comments from Dr. Nanji? Have you seen a change in the way in which the gender dynamics operates?
I can only speak from personal experience. I think the three most important influencers in my life, my mother, my wife, and my daughter, are very, very much self-made, highly independent, strongly opinionated women. So I think I probably bypassed the East African stage and I think moved on to a different dimension. But I think, as Nizar pointed out, I think the key is there's an old saying somewhere that you have a choice of imprisoning women's minds by having them live in cages because you want to preserve them as they are, or let them fly and take the risk of where they will go and how, to what extent will they fly. And I think that's probably the sense that I have of the experience of most Ismaili women that I know, is that they have made their own careers, made their own choices. They remain well grounded, but they are not limited by their gender. And gender equity is actually a principle within the informal network of rules and regulations that governs the Ismaili community.
Niyosha, this is one of your key expertise here. Is there a diaspora literature that is for women, by women, that is different than diaspora literature by men, for men, or by men and maybe read by wider audience? I'm just wondering, because I've read a lot of literature by women about their own experience coming to Canada, being both a freeing or not so freeing experience, and having to manage changing cultural norms within their community, having difficulty relating to their elders and so on. That's a big aspect of your work.
Definitely, and I think that's why it was. I was thinking a lot about the main characters and the story around them. There's definitely a difference in the texture of the literature written by women. There's, it's arguable what is women's literature. Is it just literature written by women, for women? I think we have a lot, especially the Iranian diaspora exceptionally has so many women writers. So I think it's the really interesting question for me is, again, the target audience. These stories, the stories that I work on are autobiographical, some fiction, but they're written for an English-speaking audience, like this book, and for the diaspora. That's why I'm very interested in the audience as well. So I think it's important to think about the English-speaking audience that these women are writing to, because for the younger generations of the diaspora. And I couldn't help but think about the title, rootedness. I want to speak a little bit about belonging, but what when you came up with the title, Roots and Trees, what was on your mind?
The roots and the trees. Growing up, my father used to say that it was important in bringing up your children for you to serve as strong roots, so that your children who are born will become strong trees. And as they are growing, as the tree is growing, the roots have to support the trees. They have to nurture the trees. They have to feed the tree and let it blossom. And that was something that was at the back of my mind. And in the book, what I've tried to portray is is the parents of these two boys. They serve as the trees, as the roots, and they bring up children who grow up to become strong trees and bear fruit. So that was the thinking
the metaphor
behind the roots and the trees.
Well, thank you. We have two questions I think that I want to put to you. So what contributions have Ismailis made to the wider Canadian community? Can you share examples? That's the first question. Second, did other communities that benefit from His Highness efforts to settle Ismailis in CDA, were there early interactions with other communities? Did they rely on the Ismaili experience unfolding in Canada? So, two questions. Go ahead.
To answer the first question, the Ismaili institutions, the councils and the boards that are established by His Highness the Aga Khan, they exist to serve the community and the communities in which the Ismaili communities live. In terms of an example, a recent example that comes to mind is for Canada's 150th anniversary celebrations. The Ismaili youth made a commitment. It was a program that they called the Ismaili Civic Program. They pledged 1 million hours of community service to serve a whole range of causes. And within 9 months, they had exceeded that target with 1.4 million hours. They worked they made contribution to, they worked with the Canadian food banks, the Canadian blood bank, Habitat for Humanity, building homes, serving food to the homeless, Tree Canada project, planting trees. So that's an example of the kind of involvement that the community has with the wider community. You cannot live in a country in isolation. You have to identify yourself with the people, the communities within which you live, and just not look to serve your own. You have to look at the needs of the people in the communities in which you live, and contribute not only when Canada is celebrating its 150th anniversary, but every day of the week. You have to be doing that, and that is something that's very central to the Ismaili community, to contribute to the wider community in which we live. And what was the second question?
The question was about connections with other communities.
Going back into history, our connections with, when we came to Canada, our connections with other communities were limited. We did, however, meet with other people, other communities who had come to Canada as refugees, also from East Africa or from other parts of the world. And they told us about the kind of issues that they were dealing with in their communities, and we shared with them the kind of issues that we were dealing with them in our community, and the strategies that we were employing to deal with the issues in our community. But if you are asking if there was any organized, systematic approach for us to engage with other communities, that in Canada there was not.
So
but the Canadian Ismailis contribute to the global community via their contributions to the Aga Khan Development Network, which operates around the world and is involved in enhancing the socio-economic status of the communities, 90% of whom are not Ismailis. And Ismailis, Canadian Ismailis, contribute to that effort with human resources and money.
Well, we're coming to the end, so I'm going to ask you, as I told you, to give last comments to our audience, in 2 minutes. What would you want them to take from our conversation, and beside going and buying this book and reading it? So let's start with you, Dr. Nanji.
Yeah, I just wanted to underline that there is a certain amount of fragility, excuse me, in the world in which we live. And we constantly have to work to try and make sure that it doesn't overcome us. Because we've seen, I think in the last several months, these fragilities exposed. And they are exposed in ways that can be quite divisive. And so as we look at our individual or collective experiences, I think the notion of reciprocity is important. To explore notions of belonging, of identity, of being able to situate ourselves in the place of others, and to narrow those points of difference that might cause the very strong bonds that we sometimes are able to build to become so fragile that they might fritter away.
Lots of wisdom there for us to ponder upon. Niyosha, what are your concluding remarks?
I think that this is a great book, and maybe going back to the younger characters, perhaps it could be taught in schools, and read by younger folks and the broader community. Thank you for the wonderful discussion.
Thank you. So, and last words to the author. It's 700 pages to have written, but you have more to say. Is there a sequel? Is there going to be another book?
I'm working on a sequel, which is intended to go from 1979 to 1992. 1992 marked 20 years of our large-scale settlement in Canada. It's a lot of work, and it'll take me a long time, and I hope that I'll be able to finish it. See, my book, The Roots and the Trees, is, although I've presented it as a fictional narrative, something that's intended to be entertaining and informative, it's a case study of one community, one uprooted communities, departure from countries that they had considered their homeland. That's where they were born. We didn't think of any other country as our homeland. And it's moved to Canada, and how it organized itself and settled effectively in a new land. That's what I'm hoping that my readers will look for and find in this book.
Well, welcome, and thank you so much for sharing the book and sharing your thoughts on this book. It's a good read. It's a fun read. So I think it may be a good present to give. So I want to thank all three of you for being here today, and thank you to the audience for the good questions. I also want to thank Matt Glenfield and Abarisi from Massey College to help us always deliver these good conversations with our community. So we'll wait to do finish your other book, and then we can do a second book launch. So
thank you very much.
Thank you very
for
much
inviting me.